I've done work previously on globalization and the mechanisms by which global economic integration has occurred. And that's where I want to start. I think that's the backdrop to what is going on today. My plan in my head is I have 6 points I want to make. And as I move from one point to the next, excuse me, I will identify I am moving. So the first point is the question of globalization. This, properly speaking, of course, is called the new globalization. The world was integrated to some extent previously. This is a very special kind of globalization, which by virtue of technology with regard to communications, technology with respect to transportation, the ability of production processes to be integrated over space now has, with the new globalization, has occurred. And what this has done is it has allowed countries that previously were not involved in the production of manufactured goods, now, if they engage in the appropriate policies to encourage participation in what are called global production chains, the technology is permissive of success in that regard. And so this is what we call the new globalization, a globalization which allows previous countries which previously were shut out of manufacturing now are able to participate in the linkages that occur in the producing of the final product. Success in this regard is uneven throughout the world. The technology is only permissive. It then depends upon whether the countries that are involved are able to formulate policies which encourage their firms to participate in the production chain. There is a role for the government, a very important role for government, to provide the incentives and the opportunities for their firms to do so. And then if they are successful, those firms can then participate in the global market as producers, as partial producers of the final product. So that's issue number one. This is an era that dates from roughly 1980, when the new technologies, both with respect to communication and with respect to transportation, allowed this new era to take place. That's issue number one. Issue number two, and the country that was most successful in this regard was China. And it was not at all obvious when these new technologies were undertaken, when implemented, that China was going to be successful. There had been a long history of antagonism to market participation by the government in China. And it was only really in 1978 when the Chinese undertook a policy of reform, which would encourage participation in global markets. Now, it just so happens that I was a visitor to China in 1981, and in the discussions that I was engaged in those years, it was completely uncertain that the policies that would open up the country to the new technology would be implemented. Subsequently, of course, we have learned that the Chinese have been very successful, more successful than any other country, in participating in the manufacturing of the commodities, of the products that would become components, and in some cases for final goods. China has become a major participant in the global economy, and has had a dramatic change in the level of the country's economic development. the number that I have written down here says that in 1978, this is World Bank data, in 1978, the Chinese per capita GDP was $381, and in 2023 it was $12,175, a phenomenal increase. And the increase in per capita income was largely, but not entirely, due to their success in penetrating export markets. Chinese exports as a percent of their GDP was almost 20%, and by virtue of comparison, the United States is something like 11%. So there is a very important role that participation in the global market through the new globalization that allowed China to do a phenomenal increase, virtually eliminating this growth that they experienced, virtually eliminated global poverty, Chinese poverty. Depends on how you measure it, but it was a process of growth that did fundamentally transform the lives of the people in almost all of the people in the country. Okay, so that's point number 2. Point number 3 is taking the discussion to the present and examining the situation at the end of the Biden administration and the beginning of the Trump administration. It was not possible to envision the transformation in American policy that has been undertaken, the disruption in international trade that has been experienced. In the United States, at the end of the Biden administration, the unemployment rate was low, on the order of 4% per year. Inflation had come down. It was on the order of between 2 and 3% per year. Productivity, a key measure of a country's prosperity, was higher than many of the comparable countries, for example, in Europe. And most interestingly, tariffs were low. Tariffs in the United States averaged about 3.5%. And so this was a period of time of relative satisfactory experience in terms of economic growth, in terms of the performance of the economy. Nothing like, certainly I wouldn't have conceived of the turmoil that was about to occur, envisioned in the United States. So that was point number 3. I have 3 to go. Number 4. The growth of production and the new globalization raises a complex situation for international trade. There was an international organization called GATT, G-A-T-T, that was formed in 1948 with the idea that they would get rules and try to regularize and come to a consensus on the rules concerning international trade. But by the time the 1980s proceeded and the 1990s proceeded, the GATT phenomenon was inadequate to control and regularize and organize international trade. And so in 1995, what was created was the World Trade Organization. And what principally differentiated the World Trade Organization from GATT, G-A-T-T, was there was an enforcement mechanism that was in the rules of GATT, where if the rules were not followed, and if a country protested, there was a mechanism by which the protest could be brought before a grievance commission, and sanctions if a country was found guilty of violating the rules, sanctions could be imposed. So this was a new phenomenon, a phenomenon that had to do with the increasing complexity of international trade, the fact that many countries, not the least of which was China, but other countries as well, were new participants in international trade, and there was a perceived need to get a structure to allow this trade phenomena efficiently to proceed. China joined the World Trade Organization in 1999, and this is seen as a big step, was seen as a big step forward because of the importance of China in as a export of manufactured goods. Now, I myself trace some of the willingness of the United States to disengage from this process to that period. When China joined the World Trade Organization, it facilitated a further expansion of their trade. And it did have dislocating effects with regard to employment in the United States. The growth of Chinese exports had the effect of reducing employment in several sectors of the American economy. And the scholarship on this has estimated 2 to 3 million employment opportunities were lost by virtue of the sudden growth of Chinese exports to the United States. Now, at the time, we knew that that was going on, and what the obvious appropriate response would have been was to make sure that the people who were dislocated from their employment opportunities in the United States were provided with support. We did a very poor job of doing that. And it is in that time that a growth of disenchantment with specifically trade, but particularly the World Trade Organization, manifested itself. And in the very end of the Biden administration, they took the position that the United States was going to, without announcing that they were doing so, we're going to disengage from the dispute mechanism in the World Trade Organization. They did that without announcement, but it was effective because the dispute mechanism involved 7 individuals from whom the board would be selected to adjudicate on a specific case. Well, what happened was the United States refused to appoint any new people to that board when retirements or deaths occurred. And so pretty soon, the number of individuals who were part of that dispute mechanism was reduced to a number which is below what was considered the quorum, which was 3. So there was an inkling in the beginning of the Biden administration that the United States was disengaging, was having a suspicion that maybe this was something that at the top of the administration, and that was a Democratic administration, had gone too far. But of course, that's point 4. Nobody was ready for what Donald Trump has done. I don't want to, I'm not able to be too detailed on the actual increases in the tariffs that the United States poses on the world, for the simple reason that they keep changing all the time. And the most recent thing is whether there's going to be a pullback with regard to tariffs on China. What is important, I just want to say about that is I think when all is done, the victimization that is going to be assigned with regard to international trade will be most assigned to China. I think that from the point of view of the Trump administration, they've identified that as the thing that they want to go after. Now, it's easy to say that what we hear from the Trump people and from the president himself is a lack of, to be nice about it, a lack of familiarity with economic theory. I mean, the day before yesterday, I heard Donald Trump again say that the imposition of tariffs is going to result in, and has resulted in, China paying a lot of money to the United States. That's just not the way it works. This is essentially a sales tax which is paid by importers and then is passed on either in the form of reduced profits or higher prices. So I mean, the whole discussion reveals either he's just pandering to the ignorance of the American people or actually believes this. He doesn't understand anything about, again, this is in his public speaking, he doesn't understand anything about current account. If you run a deficit against a particular country, it is not negative. It is not necessarily a disaster. They're not necessarily cheating. He has a completely mercantilist view of the current account. The statistic that they are using excludes trade in services. It is only a statistic that does manufactured goods. The United States, it so happens, runs a surplus on the current account with regard to services. And if finally, on this subject, if finally the problem of the dislocation of employment for individuals in the United States is something that you want to address, which I do, what is not going to get it done is tariffs, but what would be done is an industrial policy designed in a way similarly to what the Chinese did with regard to incentives to engage in new industries and providing the resources to do so. So I want not to go too deeply into this, except to say this is a set of policies that if there were a clear objective that is economics, it would not work. It would not be appropriate because the tariffs can't do it, and the absence of an industrial policy means they won't do it. I think it is twofold. I'm coming now to my last point. One, I think the American society, and I think Democrats as well as Republicans, but exaggerated by the Republicans, are finding it hard to come to terms with the loss of dominance that is being experienced by this society, by the American society, as the spread of economic development occurs, and as specifically the rise of a power like China. Now, I don't want to say anything about Chinese politics. That's another story. And I have some serious worries about whether in time the politics that exist in the country will put a damper on Chinese economic development. But right now, I think the only way to understand what is going on is to say this really is the problem of a hegemon worried that it is losing its dominant place in the world. But the irony here is the kinds of policies that Donald Trump is engaged in is precisely what's going to result in the hegemons being undermined in its position of status. And we already have evidence of that. The United States currency and the United States 10-year Treasury bills, always the location of where, when there was problems, people would flood into that. They've both gone down. The value of the Treasury bills have gone down. Interest rates there have therefore have gone up. The dollar has declined in value. And those are evidence that people throughout the world are really worried about the American society, American economy, rationality of its economic policy. Last point, the likelihood is, one, there will be a diminution in the status of the American economy in the world. Two, supply chains will be disrupted. Prices will go up because of that, as it did in the COVID period when there is a disruption in supply chains. Economic growth will slow. We don't know the magnitudes that are involved. I certainly don't, but I think it's clear that something like what happened in the COVID period will occur again. And then the last point that I want to make is, it's all of this is both a distraction away from good policy, and even more, a distraction away from the global threat that climate change represents. Nobody is talking about that any longer, and yet global climate change continues to exact its toll. I end with the hope that the American people will see the destructive consequences of these policies, and in the forthcoming elections will call for a reversal of our policies. I hope that is the case. I'm working myself in that regard. And I leave you then with this little bit of optimism. This yet may change.
Well, I think that I want to say it is my pleasure to have been asked to participate in this webinar. And indeed, some of what I had thought I would say, it has been preempted by that really very, very insightful presentation by Jay. Not that I was going into any depth of the economic trajectory that he did, but indeed you will see I will then just try to say briefly some introductory remarks. First of all, saying that I want to congratulate Diana Da Silva Glasgow, the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and you, Thomas, Director of the University of Ghana Green Institute, for coordinating this event. For me, it is focusing on economic prospects of Guyana, the Caribbean region, and indeed the global arena. And it is a timely engagement, largely because it is impossible to predict the next moves by the Donald Trump administration. Yet it's so important for us to try and identify what are some of the possible implications for the geopolitical relationships which face radical disruption that Jay mentioned at the very end of his presentation. For me, in trying to understand the rationale of the Trump's tariffs, which I believe we want to do this afternoon, is really turning to some of the conventional economic principles that Jay mentioned. In fact, we are informed that the use of tariffs as a macroeconomic tool is normally to achieve goals such as protecting domestic industries from unfair trading practices, decreasing trade deficits, and increasing revenue from duties. But I think Jay also mentioned that the US might be in a catch-22 situation because he didn't mention this, but reshoring, which is Trump's campaign promise to bring back manufacturing to the US, is a relatively long process. And even if successful, the US will not be able to increase revenues from import duties. I just want to say a little about the relationship with China from the perspective of a layman. I did my economics over 50 years ago. But it seems to me that the major dilemma for international trade at the moment is the more recent escalation of the war between US and China. And here I go a little further than Jay. China's aggressive retaliation, to me, diminishes the chances of a quick deal between the world's two biggest economies. And this, I believe, is triggering mounting fears of the economic recession across the globe. Even the announcement of a 90-day moratorium on the punitive tariffs, except those on China, and the temporary reversal of levies on computers, electronics, and semiconductor chips do not quell this confusion. I understand that as we speak, Trump has reversed the levy on computers, compounding the confusion and chaos. So what do I understand about these tariffs? And I'm going to not go into detail, but I understand from what is happening and from reading what most economists say and what Jay just implied, is that at any one time, we can apply one or more of the tools that are so ephemerally stated by Trump and the Trump administration. One is a reciprocal tool protecting the domestic economy from unfair competition. That is the mantra, apparently. But second is a negotiating tool to put pressure on trading partners as a bargaining chip. And then third, a punitive, and this seems to be the driving force, a punitive tool. It is the ability to escalate the tariffs as a sanction that includes non-trading issues, and therefore it is punitive. So what's the deal? It seems to me, from the point of view of CARICOM, that our trading relationships with the US has been a long time asymmetrical. And this means that the region imports far more than it exports to the US. And it is a pattern that I think, from what I understand, will be dealt with by one of the panelists, that it has really it takes no fair recognition of the concessions granted under the Caribbean Basin economic recovery. And this is the problem, because whatever are the tariff regimes touted by the Trump regime, it does not seem to take account of the Caribbean, of the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act. And this is a dilemma, so to speak, for the Caribbean. I would not go into details, except to say that we have heard from Prime Minister Motley in her capacity as to what is required. Diversification comes out. Ron Saunders, who has recently written on this matter, also speaks about diversification. as one of the important issues that the Caribbean would focus. I want to quote him now. He says, hardship breeds innovation. The private sector must not remain passive. It is the engine of diversification. Governments may build the pathways, but private enterprise must drive the vehicles. And so there are a couple of things which maybe the other panelists would deal with, having to do with diversification, especially with respect to agriculture, having to do with the question of the status of Guyana's oil in this whole equation of the incomprehensibility of what's happening, especially in view of the fact that there is the recent statement, the concern raised in the news that oil prices have dropped to their lowest in more than 4 years on the looming demand fueled by the tariff war between US and China, the world's two biggest economies. What, for example, does this mean for Guyana going forward? But let me just end this so-called introductory remarks by saying that we need to consider a couple of things. How do we prevent US policies from upending the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, approved by 193 and 196 countries in 2015? How, when combined with the incomprehensible application of tariffs, US policies, which is an assault on globalization and multilateralism, can be reversed or contained? And I want to end by a statement. It's really a meditation presented by Carmen Trumbull. I read her every week. She does a meditation. She is the CEO of a convergence group, an NGO group, and pastor of the United Church in Atlanta with a mission to empower women. She writes, and I want to quote, "Chaos is not harmless. It is a form of violence, a strategy of domination and control. When people are disoriented, they are easier to manipulate. When communities are stressed, they fracture. When systems are overwhelmed, they break." Mr. Moderator, I apologize that these introductory remarks raise more questions than they answer. But as in the case of Jay and now the others to follow, I take this prerogative in the full knowledge that you as moderator and the panelists are up to the task to explain an approach to this, what I call manufactured chaos. I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the invitation. Guyana is no stranger to me, and I'm there fairly often. This is just a timeline of some of Trump's interventions since for this year, in terms of how he treated with some of the tariffs that he wanted to implement. And he has gone back to a classic neo-mercantilist type of perspective, in which he is putting nation first and trade balance first ahead of other things. So he is prioritizing putting, as he says it, making America great again. And some of what I'm presenting here is from an article that I just sent off to our journal to publish on this topic. So you would see me using references and whatnot. Now, he has placed particular focus on manufacturing. Now, one of the concerns here, if you are familiar with the development literature and the trajectory of how nations grow, is that after a particular per capita GDP, you expect for large countries that manufacturing employment and manufacturing output would fall. So I was a bit surprised when I saw the stance of the US President office as regards manufacturing, trying to make manufacturing great again, given the great strides that China has made, when they are actually doing quite well on services, which is where you expect these giant economies over time as per capita GDP evolves to land. So in terms, so this is some of the manufacturing sector data here. And you can see employment has tumbled a bit from where it was in 1987 down to 12.8 million people employed. And the output index, you know, it has fallen a bit since about 2015, but it's significantly higher than the 1980s, suggesting that this is not such a bad situation altogether, in that employment has fallen and output still remains fairly buoyant, so that output per worker is fairly high. Productivity is not under any threat. So it's puzzling, some of these steps in that regard that the US president has taken. In terms of where this will land the global economy. So I use some offer curves here to explain how it is output in the global economy. I use a simple two-good framework with X and Y being produced, and a large country such as America, which I call the home country, and the rest of the world, the foreign country. And in initial conditions, you know, you expect the global economy to, with these two economies, to engage in a certain amount of import and export. But with action-reaction tariffs, the offer curves get compromised, and we move from offer curves such as HC1, FC1 to HCT, FCT, and therefore world exports of both Y and X become compromised, and by extension, world income become compromised. And whilst a tariff can, in a small country, be possibly welfare enhancing, in a large country, it could only be enhancing if the terms of trade effect supersedes the volume of trade effect. Let me restate that. In a small country, it's difficult to implement tariff because whatever you do, you always lose. Your consumer surplus would always decline. In a large country, you can gain by implementing a tariff if areas such as area 3, which is in terms of trade effect, is more than area 2, which is associated with the volume of trade effect. Because the USA is experiencing tariff retaliation. Without tariff retaliation, they might have been fine, you know. But with tariff retaliation, they run the risk that the terms of trade effect can be less than the volume of trade effect, and overall, they would lose out from a welfare perspective. So I looked at the effects of these tariffs here and out. I know we're on a little 90 days break. I was surprised to hear Eddie say that this may now be reversed. So I'm waiting to finish my presentation to check that there was a reversal of the reversal. I hope that is not the case. But these are the actual overall merchandise exports under threat from Trump's tariff. And when you work out the actual numbers and you put non-energy exports, because it is non-energy exports to the US as a percent of total exports of goods and services, these tariffs are not life-threatening. These tariffs are more noise for the Caribbean than anything else in terms of as a proportion of our total exports of goods and services. And we need to go about our business and continue to look for alternative markets and continue to diversify our production bases and our export markets so that should contingencies, should situations like these continue to happen, we would have more latitudinal flexibility. But it is not the end of the world right now. These tariffs are going to have very, very small impact on our total exports of goods and services. The largest impact will be in Trinidad and Tobago. And I also took the liberty for 2023 to show where the top 5 export market destinations are for these various Caribbean countries. And so whereas for Guyana and for Trinidad and Tobago, the USA stands out as a giant market. But that's when you include, obviously, energy exports as well. And the tariffs imposed by the US excludes energy exports. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that the medium-term outlook by the IMF for these various Caribbean countries is not damp. It's not excellent, but it's not very damp. And so the Caribbean market, as we know it, is not as poor and as weak and as insubstantive when the crafters of our CARICOM region started this process way back in the 1970s. And this year, you know, I look at CARICOM exports to various partner countries. So obviously CARICOM energy, non-energy exports, I focus on energy and non-energy. The non-energy exports within the region, the CARICOM associated states or the CARICOM countries or to the Dutch Caribbean or to the world paled in comparison to energy. And that's because Guyana has now joined Trinidad and the Caribbean is now a big energy exporter. I mean, surprise, surprise, the Caribbean is now a big energy exporter overall, but it's really our non-energy exports we should be focusing on. And here, I show CARICOM non-energy exports to, I'm getting a little bit in here. Right. Here I show CARICOM non-energy exports to CARICOM as a percentage of CARICOM non-energy exports to the world. So our intra-CARICOM non-energy export market has considerable room for growth if we need it. Now, I can speak for sure about Trinidad and Tobago, and I can tell you because we have a serious foreign exchange situation, I always say to the government, if we get US dollars from Guyana, Grenada, Barbados, St. Kitts, it's US dollars. And so the intra-CARICOM non-energy export market is not one that we should easily ignore. And CARICOM non-energy exports, the CARICOM as a percent of CARICOM non-energy imports from the world, there is significant scope for, I mean, the import substitution would be exact, but our intra-CARICOM non-energy export fails in comparison to our non-energy imports from the world. And so we have to pay attention to the intra-CARICOM market and see where possible for us to import substitute. Is the Caribbean a larger market? I didn't have time, Thomas, to go back to 1973, so I used whatever data I had. And as you can see, both GDP and the population grew considerably. So what I would like to I would close off by saying, these tariffs imposed by the Americans, either reversed or on the verge of being reversed once more, should be a significant wake-up call. And in this wake-up call procedure, we need to pay more attention to our neighbors. You know, I say to Trinidad and Tobago, look at Guyana and look at Suriname. Understand where their demand would be in the next 15 years. So in other words, model their GDP growth, superimpose it onto their current import structure, superimpose that onto their pattern of commodity imports, and then map that onto your export capability so you would have an idea where the low-hanging fruit lies. And the same applies to Suriname. There is a great paucity of this type of work within the Caribbean region and within the CARICOM region. And I think if we do our homework, the other Caribbean countries, besides Guyana and Suriname, we would realize that Guyana and Suriname offer lucrative opportunities to earn US dollars into the medium term as we go forward under the umbrella of the CET, and that's something we should all capitalize on. Apart from that, the CARICOM market as a whole is growing, and those little Dutch Caribbean islands like Aruba, St. Martin, and Curacao, they are fairly buoyant per capita GDP. Their demand is very healthy. You go into some of the supermarkets there, and it's no different to supermarkets in Holland or in the USA. And therefore, there are good opportunities for non-energy exports there. What we really need to do, though, is we will need to improve on regional logistics. And if we can improve on regional logistics, we can improve the density of intra-CARICOM trade and intra-Caribbean trade as well. And recently we had a very good example of that with a new shipping line forming between Aruba, Curacao, Trinidad and Tobago, and I believe St. Martin. I think it's the Don Andres or something like that. And it has led to a significant improvement in trade between these countries. And that's where we need to be pushing more of our effort in beefing up our logistical capabilities within the region. You know, we need to deepen trade ties with our fast-growing intra-CARICOM markets. And we also need to use more targeted missions to these countries to see how we can partner, what type of joint venture we can engage in, because it's always best to tap into the market on the upswing of various demand cycles. And, you know, we cannot in the region ignore our comparative advantage good. And there is so much opportunity for the further development of tourism in the region. You know, in Jamaica, in St. Martin, for example, there is tremendous scope for the Athens sector. The same for Curacao, the same for Aruba. In Trinidad and Tobago, there is tremendous scope for further ecotourism type activities. And in all of the other Caribbean countries, there are opportunities to push growth as global income increases by improving the tourism product. And I think that's where we need to build up some of our competitive advantage in terms of our export revenue earning capabilities. The 25 by 25 export target, it didn't work out, but I personally think we should push it now to 30 by 30 agenda by 2030 and go after this in a more dedicated way. At the same time, we need to pay more attention to opportunities, as I said, that arise in the largest market and the emerging markets within the region, and to beef up our logistic support so that we can improve the density of intra-Caribbean trade as compared to intra-CARICOM trade. So I will stop there and field some questions after, but that's my contribution. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Good afternoon again, everyone. So I am going to mention quite a few things that the other speakers have said, but I will attempt, of course, to not be too repetitive. So I'm looking at the implications of the US tariff policy adjustment for Guyana Strait. Just confirm, Dr. Singh, you're seeing the presentation clearly?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you.
All right, great. All right, so let me just start with a bit of context. So under the authority of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, the United States, as we all know, on April 2nd, announced the global baseline tariff of 10%. It did have individualized reciprocal higher rates for some countries. And when we look at the composition of those are countries with either very high trade deficits with the US or countries that the US, for some reason or the other, believes is engaged in currency manipulation or some sort of unfair trading practices. So we can think of this policy intervention as more or less a demonstration of US's concern about how its global competitiveness is being impacted by other trading partners and other countries that are emerging markets, markets that are expanding. It also emanates widely from the America First trade policy, which was signed on January 20th, 2025, and the president's broad trade policy agenda, which for the most part, envisions reshaping the US's trade policy landscape so that national interest is prioritized. And the critical concern for the US economy is expanding its manufacturing capacity, or limiting the atrophy that has been taking place in its manufacturing sector, and by extension, ensuring that it could address the persistent high trade deficits that it has with some trading partners. Now, in terms of a timeline, the America First Trade Policy memorandum that was signed by President Trump requested that the relevant US departments complete their assessment studies by April 1st so that the necessary interventions could be made. And as we now know, they were made by April 2nd. But as part of that memorandum, there is another directive that could potentially come on stream. The report offered a timeline of April 30th for an update on the directive, for an update on distorting impacts of foreign government financial contributions or subsidies on United States federal procurement programs. So we still have to wait to see what is going to be the outcome and what will in turn be the US's response. Now, very important to note, Guyana was slapped with a 38% rate. The rest of CARICOM was slapped with a 10% rate. So the obvious question is why? Why this higher rate for Guyana? And based on the three factors that were identified as the basis for the intervention, unfair trading practices, currency manipulations, and trade deficits, it would seem that the only logical explanation would be Guyana's trade balance with the United States. And here you have reflected on the screen our balance of trade from 2005 to 2024. And what is interesting about this is that for the most part, we've had a balance of trade deficit with the United States up to about 2020 when we started to export oil. And so oil was the game changer that led to a balance of trade surplus with the US market. So this is really a recent phenomenon in Guyana's bilateral trade with the US. And that's for general trade. When we look at sectoral data, we would see that for the most part, we've had a balance of trade surplus with our comparative advantage industries, gold, and other mineral products, fish and crustaceans, bauxite, wood, and wood products. But our balance of trade surplus with the US reached about US 1.5 billion in 2022. All right, so you notice that peak there, and then it dropped a little in 2023 and started an upward climb again in 2024. So it seems, you know, the fortunes that oil and gas would have brought, which we're all excited about as Guyanese, that we have been slapped with this recent intervention because of the fortunes that oil and gas would have brought, which would to some appear to be an unfair move. What I also wanted to say about the 30% rate, because after I saw the rate, I looked at our MFN simple average rates and applied rates. I looked at our bound rates, trying to understand where the 76% and by extension 38% came from. And it could not be replicated. And then I saw the tariff formula, the deficit divided by the value of US imports from Guyana. And I'm raising this because one of the challenges that we have with trade analyses is the unreliability of the trade data. There are errors in the trade data as reported by international agencies which could lead to misguided conclusions in our trade policies. And it's very important that it's addressed at the national level, first of all, because what the international agencies report is what we send to them. And we also need to hold them accountable for the quality of statistics that they report. When we look at International Trade Center data for 2024, using Guyana's data, or the data with Guyana as the reporter, we would essentially arrive at a tariff rate of 11.8%. Guyana's exports was about 3.3 billion US. Our imports from the US was about 2.5, which led to a balance of trade surplus of $799 million. Not as sizable as the US's trade data would suggest. But when we using the same platform, when we look at the US's trade data, we see slightly different results. The US exports to Guyana 1.3 billion. US imports from Guyana 5.5 billion, leading to a balance of trade surplus of 4.1 billion. All right, so there's disparity in the data that is presented on the same platform for the two trading partners when we assess the data respectively with each as the reporting nation. And when we use the US's data, that is how we get the 38, we get a rate of about 38%. Right? It shows the importance of ensuring that we have accurate data, and is perhaps a point for us to open discussions with the US towards renegotiating a lower rate. What I want to speak to substantially are the potential impacts for Guyana's trade flows. We know that there's now a 90-day pause. So these are really speculations of how this could potentially go if it does in fact proceed. And one of the first impacts that could potentially happen is a contraction of exports due to switching effects. If the tariffs proceed and they're implemented, we could potentially see lower consumers switching to lower cost imported items from other countries facing lower rates, including our Caribbean neighbors who are exporting competing products with us. Or they could switch to lower cost domestic substitutes, which is really the intention of this policy. Regardless of what sort of switching effects take place, it could potentially lead to a reduction in export revenues for Guyana. But very important to note, our export revenues for bilateral trade with the US was approximately 3.36 billion in 2024, which was about 15% of our total trade with the world. 93% of that came from exports of mineral fuels or petroleum. And we know that petroleum, bauxite, ores are excluded from this policy directive, which means that really what we're talking about is the potential revenue losses that will come from the excluded sectors. And in 2024, we generated about US $171 million from the excluded sectors, from the non-oil sectors. Fish, sugars and sugar confectionery, beverages, wood and wood products, preparations of cereals are some of the noteworthy sectors when you look at our top 15 export sectors to the US market. But while the revenues from these items are much smaller from the 3.1 billion that we get from oil and gas, the impacts are still worthy of note because the US market represents a very sizable market for some of these subsectors. For fish, for instance, 48% of our total exports went to the US market in 2024. So we generated about 22 million US dollars in export revenues for fish, right? But what I want you to take note of is the relative importance of the US market. 48% of our total exports to the world went to the US market. So the US market is a very important market for non-oil products as well. For sugar and sugar confectionery, which will be your candies and other products, 57% of our total exports went to the US market. For beverages, just 22%. For water, about 28%. For preparation of cereals, which would include things like pasta or chow mein and other flour-related products, 29% went to the US market. So the US is a fairly important market for the non-oil sector, and therefore we should be concerned about the potential revenue implications for those sectors if this policy proceeds. The second likely impact is on our diaspora. Diasporic trade is one of the leading factors. I mean, I don't have estimates to validate this, but if we were to do gravity estimates and try to model for the diaspora, we'd see that the diaspora plays a very important part of our bilateral trade relations with the US. US cities such as New York, and Miami have sizable proportions of Guyanese immigrants. And I believe that our diaspora form a very important purchasing base for Guyanese products that are exported to the US for nostalgic and other reasons. So the imposition of tariffs, which we know would be passed on to consumers, would mean that the bulk of the burden would likely be felt by our diaspora members, who would likely be one of the main consumer groups for Guyanese products exported to the US. Another potential concern is the economic impacts on our excluded sectors, the non-oil sectors. Right? These are the sectors that are going to face the higher reciprocal tariff. We have to be concerned about the potential employment implications. If I were to just use fish as an example, where you have over 15,000 persons involved in this sector. Further up the value chain, the domestic value chain, in processing and marketing activities, you tend to find more females being employed. So in your fish processing plants, Pretty Pausing Investments and some of the other companies that are leading exporters of fish, you tend to find more females being employed. So to the extent that this creates this economic disruptions to the non-oil sectors, we have to be concerned about female employment, right? And what that would then mean for households that are female-headed. But of course, this really depends on a very important way forward, which I think is our ability to quickly find alternative markets. Right? Our ability to quickly divert into emerging markets would ensure that much of what I'm speaking to here as the potential economic repercussions don't bear any fruition. The fourth point I want to mention is the continuation of reliance on exports of primary products. And this for me is really what has been very concerning. We've heard a lot of conversations about diversifying our export base, about avoiding the Dutch disease. And the way to really do that is to expand our manufacturing sector, to increase production of value-added activities. But what we have happening with this US policy is what trade economists would call tariff escalation. Because this policy excludes strategically important primary products, fuels, bauxite, steel, aluminum, right? Any product that the US sees as being valuable in supporting its own manufacturing capacity has been excluded. By extension, what that means is that any country that attempts to move up the value chain and produce higher value products for the purpose of exporting is going to face higher tariffs. So in essence, this policy is going to keep you locked in to a state of exportation of primary products. Essentially, what is happening is the US is kicking away the ladder from emerging markets like Guyana that are now in a position to build a manufacturing base, industrialize, and diversify its export base by essentially excluding primary products and applying higher rates to more value-added products. And this has been a contentious and sore point that has graced the walls of the WTO. It has been a multilateral concern that developing countries have generally had. And here we see the US essentially reinventing the wheel as it relates to tariff escalation, or bringing back what we'd expect would be something of the past, given the fact that several WTO negotiation sessions, including Doha, the Doha Development Round, have made it the priority of addressing the development concerns of developing countries. Another potential impact is in the increase in prices for imported products. And as Guyanese, we've had to deal with very high inflationary pressures coming from a construction boom and imported inflation because of the rise in importation of capital items in support of the oil and gas sector. But here you have another potential inflationary pressure that could come as a result of the realignment and disruption to global supply chains, the panic and uncertainty that this has created for global markets. I mean, we have the 90-day pause, but I think the pause only introduces more uncertainty because we're not sure what's going to happen after that. All of that could create inflationary pressures that could potentially feed into the domestic market and present another source of burden for consumers. And then sixth, my apologies for the misnumbering here. For me, it's the political messaging. I think this is a very important concern. The US has always been the bastion of free trade. Well, in the past, we've seen a shift in ideological thinking coming with this recent policy adjustment. The driving force behind the America First trade policy is reshoring American production, essentially bringing back American businesses. So really what we're seeing is a demonstration of fear that global competition is creating displacement. And that is true of global trade, but it also opens up opportunities. And the advice of principles of comparative advantage, extra-holding theorem, etc., is that you relook at your industrial structure and see where you have advantages. And the US has been a leading player as it relates to the services sector, the orange economy. So the policy is a bit misguided in its emphasis on reshoring production. And that concern of reshoring production stems, one of the factors leading to that is US fear over its declining technological dominance. Between 2003 and 2017, research and development expenditures in China by US multinationals grew at an average rate of 13.6% per year, while for the US, it grew by an average of 5% per year. And this is from the White House correspondence where this edict was passed. So clearly, the US is concerned about the decline in its technological dominance and its loss of manufacturing capacity to the US, to China, which has emerged as the world's manufacturing power plant. But fundamentally, what we see happening here is an ideological shift towards mercantilism. Mercantilists saw trade as being a zero-sum game, and therefore they needed to restrict imports and expand exports so that their own national interests could be safeguarded. And this is precisely what we see happening here. But I'm also concerned about what this means for some of our hemispheric agreements, the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act and the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act, and you have the HOPE Act that benefits Haiti, which are acts that the US had implemented to support our industrialization and to support our economic development. And fundamentally, what we see happening here is a reversal in the US's position and the US's I would venture to say, interest in really safeguarding the industrialization efforts and interests of the Caribbean territories that are in its backyard. So how do we proceed from here? What are the actions for Guyana? In the short run, of course, the first line of commercial diplomacy is always engagement and negotiations. So this would rightfully be the appropriate tool for us to utilize at this point in time. And based on the White House correspondence, there seems to be a lot of scope for reconsideration of the tariffs. The First America Act gives the US president modification authority, right? So that the tariffs could be removed if whatever trust the US has with individual members, trading countries is addressed, or it could potentially be increased if countries decide that they are going to undertake retaliatory actions. And that's what we see happening with the US's bilateral trade with China. So, but the negotiations, the conversation is very important in the short run. In the medium run, I think we need to be thinking about our own interests, right? I mean, the US's self-interest should be a sufficient driver for us to rethink our trade policy and consider how we can advance our own interests. And one of the things we need to do is shift to other markets where there is a demand. The US is one of our largest trading markets. It's going to remain that way because of proximity or diaspora and other factors. But when we look at the growth in bilateral trade over the last 5 years, our exports to the US increased at an annualized rate of 68.9%, led primarily by crude petroleum and aluminum ores. But we also had very phenomenal growth in other markets. Exports to Singapore grew at an annualized rate of 252%, to Trinidad and Tobago by 123%, to China 51.8%. So essentially what I'm saying is that we need to look at other markets, right? This is part of the diversification story. You're diversifying not what you produce only, but also to the markets that you export to. And I like the example of rice as a success story, as a story of diversification as it relates to export markets. In 2023, rice was about the 4th most exported product from Guyana. We were the 17th largest exporter of rice globally. And when we look at the markets that we export to, you don't see the United States in the top 5. All right, we see Venezuela, we see Cuba, we see Portugal, we see Jamaica, we see Trinidad and Tobago. And in terms of the fastest growing markets that we are sending our rice to, we see Cuba, we see Brazil, we even see Sierra Leone. So this is a perfect example of the opportunities associated with expanding South-South trade. And I think we need to expand that discussion and analysis to other non-oil products. I think there's also a case for us to revisit our tariff schedule. We need to look at our bound rates. The fact is the US was able to look at our tariff rates, look at our trade balance and find a way to slap a higher rate on us. I think as a country, we need to look at our tariff schedule, look at the rates that we are applying to different products. What are the strategic factors driving those rates? Is there still a need for those rates given the fact that our markets, our domestic market is evolving? Are those rates offering sufficient effective protection given the fact that we may need to import intermediate items, given the fact that we need to drive productive activities? I think those are some of the things that we need to consider. And finally, the long run view. I think we need to reassess how trade policy is used strategically. For some reason, in this region, we are always reactive and never proactive, right? We are always jumping on our toes to respond to some exogenous factor. And it's about time that we really try to be proactive in how we design our trade policies, It's really time that we have a strategic alignment between our wider development policies and our trade policies, right? We are always going to be impacted by beggar thy neighbor policies, such as this US intervention. But we should never be in a position where we are reacting, right? We should be looking into our strategic interests so that the impacts are always minimal. So looking at barriers to trade, behind the border restrictions to our competitiveness, barriers to intra-regional trade, right? Diversifying into higher value products, improving our productivity, diversifying our export markets. And for some reason, a very neglected element of our trade policy, our trading services, which offers so much opportunities that we are not looking at, ensuring that we have an adequate policy framework in place to address dumping, countervailing measures. These are critical considerations that we need to adopt as part of a wider strategic focus so that we are never in a position where we are always reacting, or if we do have to react, we do have sufficient capacity to ensure that the impacts are going to be minimal, right? So those are the things that I think we need to look at as we ponder how do we move from here if this is in fact implemented, and how do we improve our capacity to be resilient to export, to exogenous shocks that may affect our capacity to export. And that brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you.
I was very pleased to hear Diana's contribution, and you know, I would like to know how can we, because CARICOM moves so slowly, and I'm glad Ed agreed his own. I sit at Coated, and I'm speaking in my independent capacity here. I find CARICOM takes so long to get things done, so slowly, that we have been talking about this boosting of intra-CARICOM trade since forever. And what else can we do? I pose this question to Eddie in particular. What can we now, we are always so reactive. What can we now do in order to get this going? Recently, I reached out to the IDB, for example, Thomas. And I said to the IDB, you know, we have all these struggling Caribbean countries. I think now is the time to understand the Guyanese and Surinamese market because they are on the upswing and can represent very valuable US earning dollar opportunities for other Caribbean countries because of proximity and culture and whatnot. Nothing came out of it. And I'm asking Eddie Green here if he could use his vast amount of experience, and we all know his experience, to explain and to suggest how we could push this intra-CARICOM trade, intra-CARICOM value added further forward, including along the pathways people like Norman Gervan and they once pronounced on in the medium term period. So that would be my question. Thank you.
Not any longer speak on behalf of CARICOM, but I have a view. And the view is that you would recall that we have complained incessantly about the implementation deficit in CARICOM. And this is because CARICOM is structured in such a way that its policies are based on consensuality, meaning consensus. But more recently, the CARICOM ministers of trade and supported by CARICOM heads of government, they have changed that consensual view into a more truncated thing, that where 5 countries, it was proposed 3, but where 5 countries agree on a modus operandi, they could proceed. So consequently, what I want to say is that you yourself have pointed to some issue in which CARICOM could escalate what everyone is calling the response diversification as a response. And let me just give you two illustrations where this is happening. You yourself pointed out to the 25 by 2025 vision, which is lagging behind for several reasons, but is intended to transform the agricultural sector regionally to make it more competitive and sustainable for traditional and non-traditional primary agricultural products. And you could see some of the benefits from the trade data that are being produced, that there is some hope that there would be realization of the agricultural policy enunciated in the last 2 years. But there is one thing that we have to note. With the exception of Belize and Guyana, the CARICOM countries, at least 7 of them, their imports, 80% of their imports of food are from, let's put it this way, they import 80% of their food. And this is a stumbling block, because it means now that one has to reorient the diversification to include, I think, what Diana pointed out, to include more constructive programs that bring the wider Caribbean market into play. There is the other issue, really, that I read Delyle Worrell's piece last week in the Stabroek News, in which he puts forward something that you yourself noted in your presentation: the need for diversification of the CARICOM tourist destinations, so that you had a list of things, medical tourism, and a range of things. Now, this is the direction I think that we have to go, since services are really an important trigger, so to speak, for growth internationally, but also specifically in the Caribbean. And then the third thing that I want to say, it's not so hopeless. In fact, the CARICOM mission is expanding towards creating markets in Africa, as well as in Asia, as you noted when Diane made the presentation about the role of rice in the exportation in as far as Singapore. But I want to make a point that I think Ron Saunders made in an article last week, that it's one thing to say that we must have the shift in trade routes, but look at the logistics. The supply chain from South Florida, the supply chains are reliable, swift, familiar. In contrast, importing from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, it presents real challenges: negligible bargaining power, indirect routes, inconsistent logistics, unfamiliar partners. So it would take some time to cultivate an umbrella that makes that kind of movement a lot more viable. I'm not making excuses for CARICOM, but I'm just saying that there is now an increased awareness in terms of how they can move towards structured markets within the Caribbean, and how they can facilitate with greater speed trading routes with countries that are far abroad, far afield in Africa, Asia, Latin America, but there are certain impediments to be overcome. I just try to answer the question in that way because I thought that we need to reconsider how we view CARICOM in 2024 as opposed to 2020.
Thomas, may I intervene just briefly on this, on the question of impediments? We are all in agreement we're all in agreement about the diversification of products coming from the region and the importance of recognizing that services are very important. And we all in agreement that diversification of markets is very important. And Eddie Green just raised an impediment that's very important. That is, it's difficult to make these linkages. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires time and negotiation, and therefore there is the problem of the interim. A second impediment, which we have not yet discussed today, which is the role of petroleum. Obviously, petroleum is a source of the resources that could be used for transformation. The positive side of that is obvious. But we haven't discussed the resource curse. And the resource curse is an issue that has to be dealt with regard to diversification, because the market alone is such that the attractive magnetic effect, both with respect to employment and with respect to local resources, is very great. And so when you talk about the diversification, in fact, there's a contestation that goes on between the resources which will migrate to provide domestic services to petroleum, as opposed to these resources going into other sectors of economic activity which may not pay as well, which certainly have difficulties in constructing the production chains. What I have in my head is how long the discussion of diversification has gone on in Trinidad, and yet to a very limited extent has Trinidad Petroleum contributed to diversification as the positive role played out, as opposed to the negative role. And I think it's too soon to tell how this will work in Guyana. But the absence of the let me put it this way. The absence of a discussion here suggests to me that the impediment that's provided by the resource curse is something that will have to occur, and if neglected, the resource curse will be an impediment to diversification. So, Eddie, I'm building on impediments, and I think this is an issue that should be discussed as well. Can't hear you.
Thank you, Jay. I was just about to say, I'm going to ask forbearance of those people who've posed questions. I think we're answering them as we proceed. But I want to ask Roger to respond to both what you said, Jay and Eddie. And then, Roger, if you could address the more specific question about the other impediments to trade beyond what the ones Jay mentioned.
Problem. Thank you. So I had a few thoughts in my head, and I will try to link my thoughts to the questions because I see the time. So rather than misuse time, I'm going to try to make
Perfect.
one organized comment. Jay Mandel is totally correct in terms of the Dutch disease resource curse problem. Now, I have spent a lot of time looking at the resource curse Dutch disease problem in the region, probably more than anybody else. I understand it well, and I have been looking at Guyana, and I tell you, I have some real concerns as regards the way the Guyanese economy is progressing. But I am still digging into the data. One of the things I find is that your labor force data, Thomas, is it the Bureau of Statistics, that one on Main Street? It has started to come out at a slower pace than it used to. And I think Diana mentioned something like that in her presentation as well, in that if we don't have the data and the data in a timely fashion, it reduces the capacity of technocrats to offer intelligent, on the relevant guidance. Now, Suriname is not too far behind Guyana if all works well in terms of this Dutch disease problem. And one of the things that these two countries will have to do, because I don't see Trinidad recovering to anything near where it was. I mean, I have a good idea of the medium-term outlook in my country, and it is a great sense of heaviness that I say that. So that the two countries of the medium-term period, in my understanding of the fact, are in that order, Guyana and then Suriname, in terms of a big boom from which other countries could gain US dollars exports. I think the region, Thomas, Eddie, and everyone else, is depending on Guyana to get this correct. The region is leaning on Guyana for a type of externality spill over from its governance, so that the region would be able to benefit in some way from some of the foreign exchange that Guyana is generating for our exports into the Guyanese and into later on into the Suriname market. So I say that openly and honestly for that you all have a regional responsibility. Some of us are really struggling for foreign exchange. In Trinidad and Tobago, the difference between our reserves and external debt is now minus 273 million US. We have some work to do. So this is where, and again, it's not often I get to say, Eddie, I have tremendous respect to him, Thomas, so sometimes I'm directing my comments directly at him. So, because I know he has the capacity to escalate them. This is why, Eddie, I think the efforts from CARICOM has to be doubled in terms of regional integration, in terms of intra-CARICOM trade, in terms of deepening the logistical support between member countries to the other. And Guyana may just well have to treat that as a public good and with externality benefits, given that Guyana may be the only player that could move that intra-CARICOM logistical support now. I'm not saying Guyana has to go and pick up 5 billion US and do this. I'm saying that the only player with the capacity to make it happen within the next 5 to 10 years may be Guyana, and therefore the rest of us in the Caribbean wait and hope that she may take the lead in that direction as a public good, because it would also open up route for the type of goods that Diana spent a lot of time mentioning, non-energy exports. Now, the non-energy export sector, Thomas, as you would know, takes the biggest hit when the energy sector booms. And every time I come to Guyana, I keep a close eye on what I see, and I see the squeezing of, I see the boom in the non-tradable sector. I see, we call it gravel, I think you all call it sand, at almost every household step. So I have a good idea of the magnitude of the construction boom. I mean, in some places you can't even move in traffic. Anyway, to summarize, 1, we need to work on the impediments. 2, Guyana may need to take the great leap of faith forward as it is in the upswing and an early phase of this boom, and open up some corridors of opportunity for the rest of Caribbean and make the money back in the medium term through expanding its non-energy export sales in the region. And also, between Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, we work together in a collective way, given that Petro-Carib is under such threat, to see if there are any opportunities to strengthen intra-CARICOM energy security. I try to give a few points there and slightly cover some of the things you raised, so I would allow somebody else because I know the time is a concern.